welcome everybody to this panel where we're going to be discussing implementing responsible research assessment in India. So just to let everybody know, we are recording the session and we are going to be sharing it publicly after the event. So to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Rebecca Lawrence. I'm Vice Chair of DORA and I'm also Managing Director of F1000, which is an open research publisher. And I'm going to be co-hosting this meeting alongside Dr. Moumita Koley, who is on the DORA steering committee. Moumita, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, apart from being a member of this DORA steering committee, I'm a policy researcher with Department of Science and Technology Center for Policy Research, and also I'm a research fellow at Research and Research Institution, RORI in UK. And my research focus is a lot on responsible research assessment, open science, and efficiency of science ecosystem. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Moumita. Okay, so this event that you're at has been organised by DORA in partnership with Moumita and with Madan Muthu, who I think many of you in India will know very well. We're really excited today to hear from our distinguished panelists from India and Europe about the status of and how to implement responsible research assessment in India. So the goal is that we're going to leave here today both with a better understanding of the issues around responsible research assessment and how it can benefit the Indian research system. So the plan is I'm going to start by briefly sharing a summary of DORA, who we are, what we're about. Moumita is going to briefly introduce what is responsible research assessment and what are the challenges that it's trying to solve. And then we're going to hear from our panelists about reflections on how they see responsible research assessment in India and how to move forward to implementing it, also in light of international experiences. So as part of that, really keen to make this an interactive session. So please throughout, add your questions and comments into the chat and we'll do our best to try and address as many of those as we can as we go along. And Moumita will be keeping an eye on the chat and we'll be highlighting and summarising your questions at appropriate moments. We'll then wrap up with some practical suggestions for next steps from our panelists in terms of what we might want to do to move forward, so that this isn't just another nice discussion, although I'm sure it will be, but also actually what are some practical takeaways here. A few housekeeping rules. We are in a meeting format. Please do keep your microphones off. Please feel free though to use the chat function, not just for comments and questions, but also please do share any resources that you would find useful to share. The point here is that we're learning from each other. So if there are useful documents or resources that you've used or you're aware of that you think this community would find of value, please share them in the chat so others can benefit, and we will also share them at the end again as well. And then with us today, managing the meeting is Jivana Lima, who is our program manager for DORA. So big thank you to Jivana for supporting us today. She's coordinating everything behind the scenes, and she's also going to be taking notes of the discussion for a write-up after the event. Also, if you've got any technical issues, please just message Jivana directly. So before I give an introduction to the panelists, I'm just going to give a very short introduction to DORA and what DORA is about. So DORA was launched in 2012 as a declaration. And there were a number of key themes to that declaration. The first was to move away from using journal-based metrics as a surrogate quality measure of quality of an individual output. So moving away from the venue and focusing instead more on the output itself. More broadly, thinking about not just traditional research articles as the only valuable output of research, but it's actually recognizing and valuing the impact of a much broader range of research outputs. And then ensuring that we're being really explicit about what criteria are being used, whether it's for hiring or promotion or tenure decisions. So everybody's clear what the processes are and what the measures are that are being used. Now, that declaration has been signed by over 22,000 individuals and probably more importantly by over 3,500 organisations from around the world. Which is great because it demonstrates a real build-up of awareness of the challenges and issues with the traditional way of assessing research and researchers. But we've moved beyond just being a declaration and just signatories, because actually, whilst we need to make sure that we've built awareness, we need to then support, well, how does one reform research assessment? So for a number of years, actually, DORA has moved to being much more of a broader initiative whose aim really is to advance practical and robust approaches to research assessment globally and across all scholarly disciplines. So the first step, as I just talked about, is still about raising awareness, because whilst it has increased very considerably around the world, there are many communities, many disciplines, many regions, etc., where there is less awareness of what are the challenges and what are the issues. So there's still a role in building that awareness. But once that awareness has been built, there's then an important role that we see for facilitating implementation and aiding organizations in building and developing new policies and new practices for hiring and promotion and funding decisions. And then generally about trying to catalyze that change, trying to spread that reform, ensuring that we're learning from each other as to what works and what doesn't work. And fundamentally, across all of this, improving equity and ensuring that there's broader representation of researchers in the design, in fact, of responsible research assessment practices, so that we address the sort of central structural inequities within academia. So as part of this, over many years, we've developed a whole range of tools and frameworks to support organisations in a shift towards responsible research assessment. More recently, we developed something called Reformscape, which is an interactive database of basically exemplars of what other organisations have done in reforming research assessment in some way. And so the idea is that you as an organization can search the database and find organizations like you, right? So it might be in your particular discipline or in a region that's similar to your region or a similar culture or whatever it is. And you can see what have others done in that region, and maybe even reach out to them and learn from each other. So the idea is really sharing and fostering that collective learning. There's also a whole raft of different tools and frameworks. There's some examples on the right there, but there's a whole set of them that really help support research assessment reform, including, for example, that space rubric that you can see there that will help you sort of think about, well, where are we in reform and where are the sort of next steps that we could go and what are the different options of what might we want to consider. And then we have communities of practice. Most notably, we have a really active international group of funders that come together on a regular basis. We also have an international initiatives one where groups come together and share, 2 or 3 people will share what they've been doing, what they've been trying, and there's just an open discussion about those. And again, opportunity to learn from each other. Finally, we recently, as in about 3 weeks ago, launched a practical guide for responsible research assessment for research performing organizations. And the reason we did this is because we hear a lot of organizations say, okay, I understand there's, we need to reform research assessment, but it's so overwhelming, it's such a big task. Where do we start? What's sort of that first step? And so this is sort of to help do this. So we co-created it at a workshop in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of this year. And it's not a prescriptive set of activities. It's more, different options and different things that you might want to consider. So beyond the introduction, we have a chapter that has a set of 9 different key activities that you might want to do. You can do them in any order. You can do just one of them. But it gives you an idea of what you would do and some of the reflective questions that you might want to consider alongside them to help you think about, well, how might you do that? And then linking again to case studies of where others have done this in various different ways. The third chapter thinks about what are the key moments in research assessment, and where might you want to focus initially to implement some change. And then the last chapter is really how do we make sure that we're linking this up with related initiatives, some of which are in responsible research assessment and some of which are in other spaces like open science, for example, where there are a number of initiatives like the Barcelona Declaration or the UNESCO recommendations and other things that are in related spaces, and really trying to address the fact that, if we are each doing our own things and trying to encourage senior leadership within organizations to do different things and different activities, we're probably not going to be as successful as if we actually link up together and think holistically about one shared aim between us that will support both of those sets of initiatives. So I will leave it there in terms of a summary of DORA, and I will now move on to introducing our panelists. Delighted to have three preeminent speakers here today. First, Professor Krishnaswamy VijayRaghavan, who is the DAE Homi Bhabha Chair, Professor and former Director of the National Centre for Biological Sciences at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. He has served from 2018 to 2022 as the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, and prior to that was Secretary to the Department of Biotechnology at the Government of India. And until recently, VijayRaghavan was Senior Editor at eLife and is now a member of its Board of Directors. We have Professor Prof Lakhotia, who is currently a lifetime Distinguished Professor at the Department of Zoology of Banaras Hindu University, who obtained his PhD from University of Calcutta in 1970 for work on dosage compensation in Drosophila, and has been actively involved in teaching and research since then. He's known for his pioneering research on Drosophila with regard to its chromosome organization and replication. He's also been proactively involved in discussions on quality of higher education and research, publication ethics, assessment policies, and leading by example has been a strong votary for improving the quality of research journals published in India, and has been editor-in-chief of proceedings of the Indian National Science Academy, an editorial board member of numerous journals, including Current Science. He's elected fellow of all three of the major Indian science academies and was awarded the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize for Science and Technology, which is one of the highest Indian science awards for his contributions to biological sciences. And last but no means least, Dr. Michael Arentoft, who is Head of Unit of Open Science and Research Infrastructures in the DG of Research and Innovation at the European Commission. He was previously Deputy Head of International Research and Innovation Cooperation Strategy, Innovation Union Policy Officer, Acting Head of Strategy for ICT Research and Innovation, Sector Head for ICT Research and Innovation Work Programme and Planning, and Coordinator of ICT Essential Technologies and Infrastructures. Delighted to have all three of you joining us here today. But before we begin the panel discussion, I will pass over to Moumita, who's going to share a little bit with us about why we're here today. So over to you, Moumita.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And I will try to build a little context to our today's discussion that why we are bringing this discussion in India, why it is really so needed that we actually move towards much more research assessment, which is more responsible, not the metrics-driven assessment that we are seeing. Just to give a quick background, see, these are the typically few of the places where we get judged of the research that we do. For example, of course, in the PhD work that we do, then in the process of recruitment and promotions, then assessment in the external funding, like in India's cases in DST. Okay, it's ACRB is now NRF, but nevertheless, also DBT and all the other funding agencies. Then selection of scientific award and honors, and again, another very important is the university or institutional ranking framework, global or the India specific ones. Now, how this research gets assessed when we do this research? Of course, traditionally, it was always been based on the peer judgment and peer review. And to be honest, here in India, we always relied on the peer review for most of the part in our when we see in past many years, it was mostly peer review. But actually, things has changed in the past 20 years drastically. And we are now moved towards much more a publication and metrics driven world where we even the peer review is very much biased and clouded by this kind of metrics, number of publication, journal impact factor, specifically quartile, even the H index. Now, I will give some example because many a time people in India are really still in the is in a denial that we are really in the mode of this metric driven world. So for example, just as I can see from here, uh, the eligibility criteria for, we have this Institute of Eminence, a very prestigious schemes for institutions, and to apply to become an Institute of Eminence, the eligibility criteria says that you have to be top 50 ranked in NIR. And what are the expected outcome? Of course, there are many expected outcome. I took only one, where it is expected the Institute of Eminence in due time will feature in top 100 in the global indexes like Times Higher Education Index. Now, what are the flaws in this both these two criteria? Let me just highlight it here. So, for example, if you look into the NIRF, the research, how the NIRF assess research. It's entirely based on metrics. As you can see here, I have taken from the NIRF handbook, like what how they assess research is based on number of publications. And mind it, it is only if it is in Web of Science and Scopus, only in these two databases. What are the problem because of that? I will come to that later as well. But again, publication, citation, H index, Q, journal quartile, these are the only measure that they take. And just because they take this as metrics, if you can see that actually in the total way NIRF calculates the total points, quality of publication and number of publication, and if in these two parameter institutions are doing very well, they can get almost 24% of the total score of NIRF very easily. So obviously, these two would be very easily for manipulation and gimmick. And that's why we are seeing of late so much of news coming in the international media that Saudi sciences are coming from India. And I just have taken only few because I would have to then make maybe 100 slides if I would have to take all the examples that we have seen. International or nationally, people are highlighting what's going on because of this metrics obsession. What are the problems? And also, if you see India, retraction is quite high. And this is a Nature paper, but also another studies found that India will be in the third position globally if we take the retraction. And then mind it, retraction is just only one indicator of scrupulous science, and it is just a tip of iceberg. We know that not most of the shoddy papers get retracted. I will now come to the another point that I was making. Why it is not so right to look at THE ranking as the ultimate benchmark. Just this year Times Education ranking, it's a India results. And if you see that when we research quality in Times Higher Education ranking, this particular university, Chitkara, features top. And actually, Indian Institute of Science will be in the 50. And this is something, and again, Times Higher Education ranking takes this research quality completely based on journal publication metrics. And in India, if somebody is, whoever is in India, will be very shocked with this result. Can Indian Institute of Science, which is considered the best institution in the India for quality research, is so low in research quality? Now, people can also be saying that, okay, no, this is a traditional old university and not doing good anymore. But that's also on the debate because, for example, how many good research news we hear from any of this institution? Whereas, for example, today itself, we heard that a prime minister inaugurated this Chenab rail bridge, one of the highest rail bridge in the world. And Indian researcher from Indian Institute of Science has contributed in calculating the stability and many other structural aspects of the bridge. So these are the real contribution. And that is exactly what is the point that we're trying to make here. That if we just do it by research, quality or research only by metrics, number of papers or citations, that would give us this very strange results where the institute, which probably is contributing a lot, and not just this is just an example. There are many other good institutions India is contributing, but they would not feature in this top. They are not at all featuring here. So this is where we really need to ponder, and that is why we are today here to discuss much more on these issues. And I will just end it finally with this, that we cannot just rely on this commercial databases like Web of Science and Scopus, because many of our Indian journals are in good quality journals from academies of and also science academies does not feature here, do not feature in those databases. And so we are missing out a lot of good research as well. So we really need to rethink on how we want to arrange our whole research assessment ecosystem. And with that, yes, we have to understand how we can come up with responsible research assessment practices in the as well. And we hope to learn it from today from our panelists that what that we can be doing practically in India to change the situation. Okay. Thank you, Revika. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Moumita, for that really helpful background, explaining what the issues are and, as you say, why we're here to talk today. So I will now move us on to the panel discussion. As I mentioned before, if you have questions or comments, it's great to see some comments already starting to come in. Please do continue to share those, but also questions that you have to the panelists, please do add them, and we will keep an eye on that as we start the discussion. Say delighted to have three eminent scientists and policymakers here who've all been leading research and policy efforts. Maybe I can start by coming to you, Vijay, and asking you, we've heard a little bit about the context of Moumita, but I'm really interested, given the position that you've been in India, how you perceive the current state of research assessment within India.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think it's important when we discuss research assessment, we take a balanced perspective. And as Moumita pointed out, there are many very serious concerns. But in that background, many interesting things have also happened positively about research itself, even in a difficult and possibly flawed assessment system. So that balance must be kept. Now, the challenge which India has, and indeed the whole world has, is that we have moved since, let's say, as a benchmark, at the end of the Second World War, from a situation where science was driven by individual contributions in a sort of university system which had a broad sense of learning, to it become institutionalized and become an enterprise, both by funding the university systems all over the world and by setting up laboratories dedicated to research. As the enterprise has grown, its funding has grown enormously. And as the funding has grown enormously, there have been demands, rightly, from taxpayers saying, how do we know that we're getting value for what we're spending? And that results in the dawn of defining various kinds of metrics for evaluation. And the moment you define something for anyone, people will try to game that system. So you have regulatory bodies stepping in to ensure that the gaming is not taken place. There's not fraud, there's no ethics. And this becomes, an activity where there's a lot of smoke which clouds the principal purpose of the enterprise, which is to serve society, industry, and sustainable growth and discovery of various kinds. So this is a natural consequence. The question is, what does one do? One can and should bemoan the misuse of metrics, but how do we go forward? And I'll just stop after giving you just a couple of other quick points. The challenge in India, and this is different from the challenge in countries in the West, in Europe, or in North America, Japan. The challenge in India is that we have a diversity of the kinds of institutions and people. We have some institutions which are really excellent, many individuals in the university systems who are excellent. We have people who are okay. We have people who are, there because they have, decided to do research, not because they love it, for a variety of circumstances. And similarly, we have universities which are dedicated to knowledge and discovery, and others which are not, and so on. So we can't paint everything and everyone with the same brush. Now, in that situation, going forward, what can we do? And there's a simple matter which we have to learn and understand. That is, despite the size of the enterprise, it is possible to have an evaluation of the contributions of individuals, groups of individuals, laboratories, universities and groups of laboratories. This is not an impossible thing, and experts in each area do it all the time. When you ask someone, which are the best biology labs or physics labs in the country, the metrics will tell you something, but people who know the area will tell you something, which perhaps overlaps sometimes, but not entirely. So we need to move away from crunching everything down to a number into looking at a range of numbers and look.
It seems like we've lost the end of Vijay. Hopefully he'll be back in a second. I'll move us on and hopefully we'll get Vijay back. I think he was probably towards the end of his comments anyway. So I will move on and ask Subhash actually. So on that point, in terms of thinking about how we assess, in a much more holistic way in different types of groups and entities, how have you seen from sort of being in various different roles, both as a researcher but different roles within an institution, how have you seen sort of the key challenges around trying to implement responsible research assessment?
Well, thanks for continuing with what Vijay was saying. See, a major problem in India is that it has today become a compulsion to do research, not a pleasure to do research. Because and compulsion to do research under conditions which are not really conducive. Facilities are poor in most of the higher education institutions, but they're required to do research, undertake research of some kind or the other, because that's what, as Moumita said, that all the promotion rules, all the appointment rules require some research quantitation, and therefore they have to do research. And this is where I think one side of the problem is that the compulsion rather than the pleasure and desire to do research. That's one side where you have problems. And poor facilities in most places. There are some places which have excellent facilities, mediocre facility, but majority are with really very, very poor facilities. But they have to, they are still required to undertake research and declare that they are doing something. That's one part. The second part, which again Moumita had mentioned, and which I think is a major problem, the quantification of research, that the way we assess by quantity, by H index, by impact factor, by citation index, and then something which I thought Moumita would also do is all the citation index do not discount self-citation. So the gaming that goes on in this ranking business, I mean, the lesser we talk about it, the better it is, because when we begin to look deep into this ranking system, it's a real game, which was pointed out in the paper that Moumita showed, but then there are many others that have stated this, but still it goes on because it gives them the more students, because see, how does a young student know where to go for? They go by this quantitative ranking. Okay, this institute is ranked 1, this institute is ranked 100. I would go for first or 10, but not for 100. Whereas qualitatively, like Institute of Science will, in the terms of young students who do not really know what science means, for them, rank 50 is poorer than rank 20 and 30, which may not have anything. But unfortunately, this is something that has a major problem. And the other side of this is where the administrators and assessors come in between. That's where I'm sorry to think, with all my experience, that they have somehow they find it much easier to look at this quantitative parameter than to look for quality. It's much easier that impact factor gets calculated immediately and the total error. And actually, I have sometimes asked them, why do they need to be there? A computer can do the job. Why do we need people to look at and assess it? But unfortunately, this impact factor, H index, citation parameters, and so on have become so deeply entrenched. If I send biological term, gene regulators, so deeply imprinted in our psyche, that every time we talk about this, immediately comes a question: what's your impact factor? And this is where as I've been with my own experience with Indian journalists, is that we have not been able to bring them up just because everybody says, okay, what's impact factor? And you get into a vicious circle, because impact factor is not high, our established scientists do not want to publish it there, and therefore impact factor remains low. And so unless we break this circle, we will have problem. The other thing, again, Moumita had mentioned that this extreme reliance on commercial databases like Scopus and Web of Science. That's again a problem. If the two were really quality measures, then they should have had a common list, but they don't have. And indeed, there are many journals which are really poor quality journals. There are paper mill journals that have found their way in these indexing systems. And these are some of the things that we need to consider and think about how do we get out of it. I'll come back later on, but I think right now I'll stop here.
Thank you, Subhash. Very helpful. Vijay, yeah, I think we lost you on your last point. I don't know whether you just want to finish that briefly, and then I'll go to Michael.
Where did you lose me?
It was right on your last point, and you were talking about evaluating, different types of levels of individuals and projects.
Right. And, yeah. So I think there are multiple ways of evaluating. But let me just quickly add one point before you lose me again, which is, we tend to blame governments, evaluating agencies, other journals, and so on. And rightly, all of these are at fault. But I think the biggest fault are our colleagues themselves, all of us, when we sit on committees. We succumb to using these metrics and we're unable to put our foot down against it. That is a cultural problem as well as a problem of ethics and laziness. And that can change. It has changed in some disciplines. It doesn't happen as much in mathematics. It doesn't happen as much in engineering. It doesn't happen as much in physics. It does happen in all these places, but it happens most in biology and in the medical sciences. So we need to change too, and not just the agencies and the evaluation system.
Absolutely. Great point, which leads very well on to Michael. I wonder, Europe equally actually is incredibly broad, right, in terms of different countries and different challenges and cultures, etc. So in a way, there's a similar situation, I think, across Europe. And I just wonder what sort of approaches you've used in terms of the Commission, in terms of showing to national policymakers in the first instance the benefits of responsible research assessment and what kind of role evidence plays in that process.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I can recognize many of the underlying reasons for why we need to reform research assessment. The previous interventions, while they were talking in particular about the Indian landscape, it was very much the same motivations that also drove us in Europe to accelerate reforming research assessment. The expectations of research is evolving. There's increasing demands also placed on research, be it societal or environmental or economic indeed. And last but not least, you mentioned the issue of culture, research culture, which, as was pointed out right from the beginning by Vijay, has evolved over decades and we believe not in the right direction. So at the end, we saw that there was this push for acceleration for reforms, and this was driven by the need to further support the quality of the research, and in the end, of course, the impact of the research. So in starting from the point of view of open science, but I would say science policy more generally, we launched a few years ago now the QUARA initiative. So this is a coalition of all types of research organizations for advancing research assessment. The vision is very much in line with what was mentioned, to from the outset recognize that there is a diversity of research practices, outputs, activities that need to go into how we are going to reward what we value. And what we value, of course, are the types of research outputs and activities that lead to higher quality and impact. And there is the need for this balance, and there is the need to be much more based on qualitative judgments, but at the same time using quantitative indicators, but in a responsible way. So definitely beyond the H index, no use of journal impact factors or journal-based metrics in general. So the approach we have used as we started in 21 with very broad consultations of, as I said, very wide range of research organizations, from research performing organizations, universities, research centers, research infrastructures, but also having in the picture research funding organizations and evaluation agencies. Some ministries, they outsource the assessments to specialized agencies. So in 22, we had an agreement on reforming research assessment with a set of common principles, commitments, but also a timeline. So there was this point of accelerating the activities around reforms that has now been signed by more than 800 research organizations, mainly in Europe, but also beyond Europe. And at the same time, because we wanted to be very concrete, we also launched a coalition where the research organizations, the signatories, could jointly elaborate, jointly experiment with concrete implementation of changes to criteria for assessment, to processes, to different structures that needed to be put in place, sharing different tools and templates and so on, gathering evidence, which was also part of your question, Rebecca, and which is indeed one of the 10 commitments behind the agreement. So sharing these principles, sharing the commitments on one hand, but on the other hand, also recognizing that there are differences. So differences in implementation, because we have, of course, diversity not only across countries, but also importantly across disciplines, across different types of research. Research institutions have different missions. So the kind of criteria and processes in place have to be different when you go down to the individual institutional level. We're also putting funding behind it. We are not only policymakers in the Commission, we're also putting funding behind it. We support directly, give incentives to changes at the institutional level. And we're also using our own funding program, which is now called Horizon Europe, where we hand out close to 15 billion euro per year to research projects to apply the same principles and commitments that we have signed up to under QARA. You mentioned the evidence in particular, Rebecca. I think that this is particularly important, that we also, as well as a research funder, but also individual research institutions, keep being evidence informed every time there are changes. It's very important to support research on the research itself, so that we understand what assessment practices are working and which ones are not working. And of course, this is part also of experimentation and getting to the next cycle of experimenting with different criteria and processes. Maybe one last thing that is also important for us, and you mentioned it, is the underlying data, which is used for assessments, and that this absolutely need to be transparent and open. It's also linked to what was mentioned around rankings. So this whole transparency, and you mentioned also the Barcelona Declaration, which is another initiative. We are supporting already now a running project to help establish such an underlying data repository for feeding into the assessments. And we will continue to support also further evidence gathering in research assessment reforms.
Thank you, Michael. Great summary. And it's worth, I mean, the research on research, I think, is increasingly being recognized as being essential. And there are you may be all aware there's something called the Meta Science Alliance, which is actually trying to bring together organizations that are interested in doing research on research with funders to support it and researchers who are experts in it. So I think there's a real opportunity, and there are many organizations like Rory and others that are now really helping to enable us to get some of that evidence that will really help support some of these initiatives. I want to just touch on something. I think it was Vijay. You were commenting that whilst obviously governments have a role, at the end of the day, researchers, we sort of got ourselves to blame for continuing to use these practices when we're actually on committees and assessing researchers. So I guess a question actually to Subhash, in terms of how can we engage the research community in India to actually think about assessing researchers in a different way and advocating and supporting and actively acting out a responsible research assessment when they're in those kind of situations?
Hey, well, I think we have to consider from 2-3 different aspects. On one hand, are the people, young people who are embarking in research, progressing in research, and who are awaiting somewhere or the other assessment. That's one side. The other side is people who are assessing them, evaluators, agencies, committees, and so on. Now, unless both of them realize this thing, that there has to be a responsible assessment, this will not work. So on one hand, to the young people, we can talk about what are the ethics, what are the ways, why do we do research? That research is for pleasure, it needs passion, it doesn't need compulsion. But the reality is it's becoming more of a compulsion today. Whether you like it or not, I have to do research because I need that number of papers or something or the other to happen to this. So this is one side where we need to handle the situation. But I think the more important is the kind of rules and guidelines and processes that we have evolved, that we have made to assess this. They needed absolutely radical, drastic change. I can say with some experience, but also a little sadness, that we did draft a set of guidelines for the Indian National Science Academy. How do we assess them? It was accepted by almost everyone, but then in implementation, it doesn't happen. You see, our funding agencies, our rules and regulations, even we have accepted DORA, but the forms still continue to have impact factor as a parameter. For example, only yesterday I was filling up a form for applying a grant, and one column is impact factor. And I simply say, I do not know. That's my answer. Because I don't want to give impact factor, but that's what is required. Maybe I can afford to do it at this stage, but a young person cannot afford to do it. And this is unless we really change these bureaucratic procedures that have been going on, and in spite of agreeing that we should not do it, we continue to do it. Likewise, the other thing that we should really do is, instead of asking how many papers you have published and what the total impact factor citation, I think we should ask every individual just a limited number of papers, 5 or 10, depending on how many years one has. If it's a senior person, you ask for 10 papers. If it's a young person, ask for 5 papers, and let them explain why they consider these are important. And let those papers only be really evaluated by experts, because no expert can spend time in looking at 100 or 200 papers per person. But 5 or 10 with some leads can be useful to assess the quality part. Because what's important is the quality part that we need to assess. And we need to devise ways to do this. And that's one way that, okay, you don't ask the total number of papers, you don't ask all that. You ask them, but then you assess only on certain, for example, somebody may have one key paper, which is very critical. Let's assess on that part, instead of 1 out of 100, how many it is. And then the equally important is, for example, that the current emphasis on, as Vijay said, okay, public wants to know what it has happened. So one is ranking, one is impact, but then more important is now what we are facing is applied versus basic. And there's greater and greater emphasis on basic, and therefore, again, that's leading to all kinds of patents being sold, patents being purchased to claim that we are doing applied research. We need to change. We need definite changes in these parameters. We need to do basic research as much as applied research, and of course, there has to be much more funding, much more building of infrastructure in a large number of places, which is happening. But I think the scale at which we are growing, it needs much more funding than what we are getting now. And that's where I come back to again point that our 0.6% of GDP for a country like India is too small. It just cannot help. We need to spend much more on the funding, on infrastructure development, providing incentives to this. And then, of course, ultimately, the challenges with the experts who are sitting on the assessment. They need to be trained. They need to understand. Because very often when I talk to young people that, okay, on research ethics, which I've been doing very frequently as regular classroom teaching on many lectures, other places, one question that comes every time back to me for which I can't answer, what do we do if we publish in these journals or we have few publications, we do not get the opportunity for a job. Now, unless we change this, it's going to be very difficult. And this requires, of course, discussions of this kind, education, and wider discussion, wider issues on this. And of course, I would say everybody must remember that research has to be a passion and pleasure, not a pain to or a compulsion to do it. If you understand this, right?
Sorry.
Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you'd finished. I was going to say, I mean, you pointed out some great examples of different things that we could do, and indeed there are organisations. I know Ginny's put in the chat some examples from NHMRC in Australia, but there are many examples of doing exactly what you're suggesting in terms of actually not asking for the full list of full bibliography essentially, but actually selected papers and what was the impact of those. So I guess a question maybe to you, Vijay, is you know, how do we get those sort of changes within funding organizations and institutions and policymakers, because we need alignment, right, between those different organizations, so researchers don't get trapped between different organizations asking for different things. So how do you think we can actually start to encourage adoption and alignment between those organizations?
You know, while we are caught between a rock and a hard place, and I'll explain that, there are some examples of individuals and institutions who have managed. What are the rock and the hard place? And one fundamental problem is our recruitment, our promotions, you know, the lack of tenure decisions or the misuse of tenure decisions, all come from using these quantitative measures, which are designed to ensure, to prevent bias, to prevent unfairness in recruiting, and to ensure that everyone has a fair chance. Now, that has descended into very problematic quantitative measures. Even in institutions which have the flexibility to recruit in terms of excellence, they start counting papers from elite journals, from vanity journals, and then hire people. They don't do their job well. So you're caught between these two. One is there's a lot of hiring which takes place without thinking, and then there's also a lot of wrong thinking. Now, if you look at America and China, which are occupy the first and second place in terms of both retractions and bad papers and so on, in addition to top quality papers coming from there, they are different from India because the huge volume of high quality papers which also come from there. So their bulk of problematic publications are a consequence of having a huge bulk. In India, the high quality papers are of a much smaller number, whereas the quantity is very large. So we have a much more serious problem to address. Now, the question you asked is, how can we go about addressing this? And to my mind, in the chat, we had Sunil Mukhi putting this up clearly, is various kinds of institutions, colleges, research institutions, universities, must write down clearly what are these factors they want to look into, how are they going to look into these when they go into hiring, tenure, and promotions. These must be written down as opposed to loosely stated saying, we don't do this, we don't do that, and so on and so forth. And then, like Subhash said, in some places, you will evaluate the top 3 or 5 papers. In other places, which are more teaching anchored, you will look at teaching experience. In a third place where the institution is geared towards very applied oriented work, you will look for team effort and how it's done. But these have to be written down. And they have to be written down at the institutional level and not just at the government level and left of that. So this is doable. Again, I would say that this is doable bottom up. To ask that it be done only top down will not work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've got a question from the audience, which I'm going to ask to Subhash and Vijay, but I'll ask the equivalent question to you, Michael, as well, which is, so are there any examples, basically, of responsible research assessment in Indian institutions that you could point to, and what are alternatives to journal-based metrics? So maybe if Subhash and Vijay, you could give a short answer to that, and I'll ask Michael in terms of thinking from your perspective, what examples you might be able to point to there. Please
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
the question was not clear. Your voice went down in between.
Oh, I'm sorry. Any examples of responsible research assessment in Indian institutions, and what are alternatives to journal-based metrics?
Okay, and I have yet to see a good example, honestly speaking, in any institution. So I can't say that, okay, here's an example which is doing the best way of doing it, because almost all that I know are based on these metrics. And therefore, maybe less, maybe more. So I still do not know whether there is any example in India where assessment has been done in a responsible manner as we would like it. Vijay, you may say something more. You have.
Well, I know of at least 2.5. I'll name one because I have no sort of deep bias on that. It's the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, which is a part of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Over the last 15 years or so, their hiring has been absolutely top class. And their hiring is a very rigorous process where they go through interviews, seminars of people who apply, but also discuss their work in great depth. And many of the papers which have been published, and this is also a peculiarity of the area of physics, are in archives, or they're about to be published, and so on. So they've made those hirings, and they've also got in their promotions a similar rigor. Now, the question to be asked is this a peculiarity of theoretical physics that they can do that? Because physics quite often, despite different views on the kinds of quality of the physics output, there's, you can recognize high quality relatively easily. In biology, you can cover up poor quality with smoke and mirrors and firecrackers and so on and so forth. So the question is, are there examples in biology of this kind of quality in hiring? And here I would say that I'm biased, but at least for many years, the National Center for Biological Sciences has been very good in its hiring, in its tenure decisions, and in its promotions. Not perfect, a lot of room for improvement, but still reasonable. Now, you could say that these two are both examples of research institutions. Even worse, you could say that they are examples of research institutions which are well-funded. Even worse, you can say that they're disconnected with the large reality of the rest of India. But that said, historically, there have been some very good examples which have declined, and that shows promise for going up. BHU, where Subhash is from, has made many good hires in the past. Again, with its growth, it's had problems. Pune University has been terrific in many ways historically. Madurai University, Baroda University, these places have not hired entirely, poor quality people, and many people have done reasonably well. The Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics, which is part of the university grant system administered institution, founded by Jayant Narlikar, has done a terrific job of hiring. Again, imperfect, but reasonably good. Many of the new institutions, the ISERs in Pune, Bhopal, Trivandrum, these places, Kalyani, have made reasonable hires, but they're suffering from also the speed of hiring and the inability to grasp the nettles of tenure policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And Michael,
Well,
very
and then,
briefly, yes, go ahead, Subhash.
Just one point. You see, when I said I was talking mostly of universities, the problem with universities is they are now bound by completely by A to Z rules that Universal Grants Commission has formulated. There is no scope for individual choice-based system that an institute can have this or that, and that's where comes the real problem. That because we have made such watertight rules and regulations, so many number of papers, so many number of this, so many number of this, and that's where the whole problem goes on. Yes, some institutions have been doing well, but there again, the assessment is not always based on criteria other than these quantitative parameters. That becomes one of the fundamental issues, and that's where my comment was, that most of them, they have had good people, yes. I'm not saying that they are all bad, but the parameters to assess has been metrics-based in large number. That's the point I was making.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Michael, do you want to just very briefly give us some examples from Europe, and then we will wrap up?
Yes, I wanted to support the previous interventions also about the need to have a certain degree of coherence and alignment between the different types of assessment systems, be it for individuals, for research organizations, or for research or research proposals as such. The example I can obviously mention is on the latter, because we are also a funder, so we assess tens of thousands of research proposals every year. And here we have in the criteria that we use when we look, for instance, at the capacity either of PIs, so of individuals, or of consortia for larger projects. We look at the whole diversity of research results from previous work, not just publications. We do not at any point use the journal impact factor. So this is already in place in our programs, and I must say also in many or most of the national research funding programs that we see across Europe that have to a large degree also copied the criteria and the processes we use. The processes are very important as well. It's very important that already from the stage of the applicants that we get the right information for the assessors to have a look at. It's very important, and you mentioned it, the capacity, the capabilities of the assessors. So the training is very important, the briefing for them, to make sure that they indeed get this right balance between their qualitative judgment and any kind of quantification they might use, and to make sure that they use those responsibly. Maybe one more point, that referring back to what Vijay said about taking action, and the important part also of the QUARA initiative is that signatories commit also to have action plans, and that at institutional level. And I think that, of course, we cannot take them to court, but the fact that they are publishing that, putting it out in the open, and thinking about how to experiment with changes in the institutions, I think is a very important part to accelerate reforms. And reforms, indeed, we are dealing with an issue here where there is a first mover disadvantage, and so the critical mass aspect, there must be a certain critical mass that are moving forward on several fronts at the same time for this to change.
Thank you, Michael. I think we could probably carry on talking about this for several hours. There is a lot to delve into with this. So this is sort of the tip of the iceberg, but I think we've touched on many good points. And within there, I think we've touched on a number of potential practical suggestions. But I think one of the things that we're planning to do after this is actually to pull together a paper where we can maybe touch a bit more on some of the real tactical and practical suggestions of what we can do next, and hopefully also touch on, I noticed towards the end, some further questions coming in and comments coming in, so maybe we can also touch on some of that. But Moumita, do you want to just summarize what the sort of next steps are going to be from this?
Yeah, sure, Rebecca. So Yeah, of course. Thank you all our panelists for such an engaging discussion. Of course, we started with the challenges, but I think down the line we also came up with quite few concrete examples that can be to us where what we can adopt it in India for the responsible practices. So what we plan to do from the today's discussion is, of course, with the background of the challenges that we are facing in India, and also what Professor Vijay has mentioned, that why it is so much problematic for India, not so much for US and China, specifically with in terms of this bad quality paper. So we wanted to summarize all this discussion that we had done today, got the insights on the reforms, that how we can take the steps towards reform in India. And this all will be summarized in a small white paper. And then we will circulate it among all the major funding agencies of India, institutions, and of course also to the individual researchers. That's our kind of the step that we want to take forward. And of course, afterwards, we will definitely try to engage with researchers, policymakers to see how we can take the responsible research assessment agenda forward. That's the plan. So soon you will see our white paper.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Moumita. So yeah, we're looking forward to obviously keeping the conversation going with all of you. If you're interested in having these types of conversations within your organization, please do email us at info@sfdora.org. We'd be very happy to introduce DORA and its resources to your university or funder community. We've seen some countries also starting independent communities of practice to implement these changes, where you can exchange good practice and examples, and obviously we're very happy to help support you where we can in getting those up and running. We will be sending everyone an email with a recording and the resources that have been shared in the chat today. So we invite you to join the newsletters, follow us on social media, so you get updated on all of those kind of things. And it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to all of you for coming today, but in particular for our incredible panelists. Really appreciate the rich discussion. Thank you to our audience for sharing so many insightful questions and resources and comments. Thank you very much to my co-host, Moumita, and to Giovanna for keeping everything running so smoothly in the background. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
you.
everyone. And
all
I
the-
would like to point one comment Madan made in the chat about how we got a slave of this ranking system, how it started. I'm sure it will be very interesting for people who were questioning the hold of commercial entities in Indian science. So I think there are a lot of history to it as well. So thank you, Madan, for putting that
call.
comment.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.